There are only a handful of photographers whose work is instantly recognizable, and fewer still who have become a genre unto themselves. I was first introduced to the pictures of Gregory Crudson through a body of work called Beneath the Roses. I felt instantly connected to that world he's so meticulously crafted, and I've been a huge admirer of his work ever since. In 2016, I had the opportunity to sit down with Gregory for a conversation about his body of work called Cathedral of the Pines. It was a terrific experience, not just because Gregory is one of my favorite photographers, but because it provided a glimpse behind the curtain to a photographic world that I find both moving and familiar. In 2018, Gregory began making photographs for his newest body of work. An Eclipse of Moths continues his exploration of themes like brokenness and isolation, as well as a profound connection to light and the encroachment of the natural world. To some, that world may seem bleak, especially on first glance, but a deeper look will reveal a narrative that is hopeful and rich with possibility. I'm just as excited to say this now as I was the first time. My name is Jeffrey Sidoris, and this is my conversation with Gregory Crudson.
Please listen carefully.
Thank you for being willing to do this. I really can't thank you enough, both for making the time and for allowing us back into this world. What is it about this geography? It seems to be such a part of you. Could these pictures have been made anywhere else? Or do they necessarily have to be part of this place, of this environment?
Well, do you think there are photographers or artists in general who respond to particular places for a whole kind of network of reasons, some of them conscious and some of them unconscious? And I definitely identify myself as an artist who works in a certain kind of setting or geography or landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than other photographers who work in a much vaster geography or like have a restlessness. I feel like I'm working most efficiently when I'm in one place.
Mm-hmm.
I rather go deeper rather than wider.
Right.
And there is a contradiction in the work, though, because like in one hand, it's very specific. It's very like, I keep working over and over again in this setting because I like the way it looks. But at the same time, I want the locations to feel like it's, it could be anywhere,
Mm-hmm.
Any place or anywhere. And there's that, so it's a sort of strange contradiction in the work that like, as you were suggesting, that there's something that feels familiar, but also enchanted or mysterious.
Has your connection to the place changed over the years in terms of the aesthetic connection versus sort of the emotional or existential connection? Has that changed since you started photographing there, and how?
Yeah, everything changes all the time, always, and then everything stays the same. As my life changes, as I grow older and as things change in my life, like I moved out of New York some years ago and moved up here. All those change your relationship to the place in one way or another. But the basic job remains the same. The job is to make pictures that have the quality of something that's both beautiful and mysterious,
Mm-hmm.
And you hope that like with every picture you take, the reasons you're making these pictures become slightly more clarified. But those, it also remains elusive, and that's why you keep doing it.
Sure. Yeah, I love the idea of depth. And you said at one point, and I'm sorry, I don't remember where it was, but it was something to the effect of every artist tells one story or has one sort of central story to tell. And I love that idea. I watched an interview with Brian Eno, and he said kind of the same thing. He said, I think I've only ever had one idea my whole life, and I've just been sort of chasing it and refining it for the last 4 decades or whatever. And that seems to be how you approach your work as well. Is that fair?
It's absolutely fair. I have said many times before that I do feel that every artist has one central story to tell. And that story usually emerges when you come of age as an artist. When you're sort of at that intersection of being open to influence and also having that sense of like ambition and clarifying in your head, the things you love and the things you hate, the, huge influences that shape you, the movies that you love, the music that you love, the books that you love. There's only a small window when you allow all those things into your life and into your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And then you spend, I think, the majority of your work in life revolving around those issues and redefining them and questioning them and reinventing them. But, it's a continual circling around the same motifs and preoccupations. You do everything you can do to like reinvent them, dramatically change the form of them, but you're never really able to get away from yourself. So when you look back at the work you've done, even if it's radically different form, it's still revolving around those same preoccupations that defined you at that certain age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember hearing someone saying that you will never be as sort of connected to or moved by music or film or experience as you are in that small sort of junior high school window when you're trying to figure out who it is you are and what you believe and where your place in the world is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's that like, you're in one level you're open to it. You're almost vulnerable to influence. And then on the other level, it's that like complete like sense of like confidence and verging on arrogance of youth that
Right.
like you feel like you have a clarity in terms of, again, the things you love and the things you hate, and everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you grow older, you continue to have an appreciation and love for many things, but not in the same way.
Sure.
Like it's a different relationship to those things. And then almost necessarily, you have to sort of protect your particular vision. You do have to close down. And I think that's also human nature in a way, to be able to focus on the thing you need to do next. At the same time, you're always looking for outside influence too. So there's no absolute equation about how this works.
Are students that you work with, are they able to hear this? And young photographers, new photographers, are they able to hear that there is so much process to get around it beyond what you do with the camera?
They are now in that place where I was, so many years ago. And I think that, like, what I try to do as a teacher is give them space to find their own particular view of the world, I try to offer advice and suggestion and commentary. But in the end, it's really their job to find that, like, particular balance of finding their own story and their own form. And only they can do that.
Right. Do you get the sense that they want to tell, how would I say it? Is it more important to say something unique or to say something important with your work?
Well, I think that the only thing you can do as an artist is contribute your own particular view, which is a very complicated brew, really. I always say it's like three competing forces coming together when you're making artwork. Let's say photography for the sake of a certain kind of clarity. So when you're making pictures, you're always responding to other pictures. So you're always, in one way or another, referencing the conventions and traditions of the history of the medium, right? And what you do often is, like, you absorb the conventions of things that have influenced you and that shaped you, and you're attempting to reinvent it in some way. So there's the history of the medium that you're referencing. Then there's, like, the personal story that you bring to it. Like, you have your own very unique set of obsessions and fears and desires, all that kind of the murky story of your biography that's exists in all of us. So that's the second force, I think. And then there's the moment that you live in. There's, like, the culture that you exist in. And if all those three forces are working in a kind of balance, that is the tradition of the medium, your own particular story, and the relevance of the moment, then your work is operating in a way that's, like, really at the highest level of what art is meant to be doing, right? It's communicating in a way that, like, is honest and truthful to the history of the medium, to your particular view of the world, and to the world that it exists in.
Do you recognize that more readily in your own work now, when it's happening and when it's not happening? And can you predict it more effectively?
Yeah, well, there's again the contradiction. It's like something you can't really consciously do. So maybe that's the fourth part of it. Fourth part of the equation is you really don't have control of any of it.
All of this exists theoretically.
Yeah, but very concretely when it happens.
Right.
So, when I'm making pictures, it's very rare, if ever, that I'm, like, thinking of other pictures of other artists. But it's all inside me. Like, I know, if I stop to think about it, the reason I use a particular kind of car, it's because I was influenced by, let's say, Stephen Shore or Sternfeld when I was coming of age. And that's what the cars in their pictures look like. But it's not something I, like, spend too much time thinking about when I'm making a picture, or I'm not saying to myself, oh, I should make this picture, like, feel particularly voyeuristic, or, like, just, like, have a sort of strange sense of dis-ease because that's going to reflect my psychology? Or do I say these pictures need to have like a connection to, the political moment we're in,
Right.
you know? So, it's all like working in an undercurrent and like it's submerged. But those things are really operating on one level or another.
Well, I think that's part of the brilliance of the work, to be honest. I mean, there's an enormous amount of ambiguity, yes, but I find myself okay with that. And in fact, I welcome that. I don't need the specific answers, at least not from you. I think that one of the aspects of your work is your generosity with the viewer in crafting that space for the viewer to fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
For the viewer to fill in what any sort of potential meaning there is to them that exists aside from what the picture may mean to you. And I mean, was that always the case for you? Were you always comfortable with giving an audience that much space? Was it a conscious decision, or is that just how it sort of evolved for you?
Well, I think as a photographer, you have to be comfortable with it. I mean, that's part of almost the given of the medium, that it's limited and restricted by form, that like, and that's why I feel that like the more literal a photograph is in terms of like any kind of narrative or even political messaging, or the less effective it is, because it's going against its ambiguous nature. I mean, I respond to photography precisely because of the fact that it never completely unveils itself in terms of its ultimate meaning, unlike other narrative forms, of course, precisely because it's a frozen moment and silent, that it opens itself up for interpretation and questioning. And so that's part of the medium that I really respond to, and also, of course, make part of the meaning of my pictures. Is the open-endedness of it.
Do you get any sort of sense on how the pictures are being received now, sort of mid-lockdown, mid-pandemic? People may be coming to your work for the first time, and they're seeing that work through the lens of lockdown, right? Through the lens of kind of the world falling apart in a way. Does it take on a different meaning as sort of a reflection of that world, or vice versa?
I mean, yes, absolutely. Of course, it's completely unintended.
Sure.
We made these particular pictures, an Eclipse of Moths, in the summer of 2018, and I was just attempting to make a series of pictures with a certain parameter, in terms of what I wanted from them. And we could have never imagined that they ultimately would be exhibited and come out into the world in a very dramatically different world that they were made in. But maybe that's why the pictures, there's nothing, as we were just talking about earlier, there's nothing dramatically new or different about the vision. I mean, there are changes, and there are things I was attempting to do formally in these pictures that I haven't done before. But it's very much coming out of the same place as all the previous pictures. So it's just like everything else, it's taken on new meaning in the circumstance we're in. And I, of course, am moved by the fact that like people seem to be responding to them in new ways,
Do they still see them as hopeful pictures? Because I know when we spoke last time about Cathedral of the Pines, you were very clear that you saw the work as hopeful. And I agree with you about that. I think it is hopeful work. But there's an initial kind of knee-jerk reaction, I would imagine, to the world that you meticulously sort of craft. But where does this body of work sit relative to that? Do you feel like you're still on kind of a hopeful trajectory with this work in terms of what it's saying or what you want it to say?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's, for me, like if there wasn't a sense of hope or redemption in the pictures, I wouldn't be interested in making them,
Mm-hmm.
But like in all my pictures, I want to balance or find a kind of exchange between a kind of darkness and dislocation and sense of possibility in the pictures. For me, it usually almost always the hope comes out of the form of the pictures, the use of light and color and atmosphere that like makes them what they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, so it's always, again, it's not something I'm like think too much about, but like there's always a theme of those well, in this particular body of work, there was definitely a theme of brokenness.
Mm-hmm.
That there was just like, in terms of what was being photographed, that motif was in many, if not all the pictures.
We're still in the same universe, it feels like, even though these are unique to this body of work, it still feels like we're sort of chapters in the same narrative because there is a cohesion between them that I get anyway.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's all part of one world, I think, and I almost see an Eclipse of Moths as the flip side of Cathedral of the Pines, that they're working out similar themes in almost oppositional ways. Like an Eclipse of Moths was like a return to nature. They're more intimate. There are many interiors. There are also a lot of wood scenes and forests. And in contrast, these pictures are vast and open. They're primarily cityscapes or at the edges of cities. The figures are small in frame. So there's a very different kind of viewpoint, yet there's definitely continuity there.
Mm-hmm. I love the role that nature plays in your work, whether that's sort of more subtle or more overt. There's an encroaching sort of nature reclaiming the urbanized world feel that I find really intriguing. That yes, there are these sort of dilapidated buildings, and there are man-made machines that are falling into disrepair, but they're surrounded by this beautiful, vibrant, thriving greenery.
Yes. Thank you. That definitely was a theme that I really wanted to run through the pictures. They were made at the height of summer. There's a nature almost in every picture kind of impinging on the settings and both providing almost like a sort of a quiet threat, but also a sense of renewal,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that definitely was, for me, part of the meaning of the work.
Yeah. I think for me, it's one of the strongest aspects of the work because, like I said, I grew up in Southern California where you're surrounded by concrete and more concrete.
Yeah.
And we had to drive to the nature, right? We had to drive to trees, forests, streams. It wasn't around us. And now having lived on the East Coast for almost 5 years, this type of vista is everywhere. And I mean, the people that live here sometimes, I think, take it for granted, but I'm in awe. Even just driving down the highway, these beautiful trees that flank each side of the roadway. We didn't have that growing up. So there is this, even in that sort of limited capacity, there is this connection that you feel to the natural world. You know, and some of the feelings that I get with this body of work is that humans have in some way, we're almost returning to these sort of nomadic passing through the world rather than staking a claim and having any sort of root system or permanence to the world.
That's nicely put. You know, that, they're definitely wanderers in the work. You know, they're tend to be smaller in scale, and there's a kind of dislocation between the scale of the figures and the larger landscape. And, you know, even the title, An Eclipse of Moths, is like kind of a metaphor for, like, it's actually, you know, I think probably know it's a term meaning a constellation of moths that are attracted to a light source. And I saw these figures, you know, being drawn to street lamps, and just that, again, that sense of trying to connect with something larger than yourself.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about the music? Because this is such it's such a brilliant value add and emotional add to the work. I'm curious, how the connection between you and Jeff Tweedy happened. Who approached whom, or was it sort of mutual admiration? And then I've got a couple things that I'd love to touch on with you as well.
Well, in a very real way, Wilco has been the soundtrack to our making pictures for many, many, many years. Like, if I sort of go back to works that we did throughout the years, you know, there would always be, you know, playing in either like location scouting or on the soundstage, you know, albums that just came out, or so Wilco always was on heavy rotation for us. And so, yeah, definitely I was always an enormous fan, but also felt connected to their, you know, similar ways, that kind of very American sensibility, that interest in beauty and sadness and storytelling. And then Wilco began doing these, you know, solid sound festivals at Masmoka, which was a great coming together, because, you know, I had my first show there, and then I was on the board of Masmoka, and so there was that connection. And then there was a time where I approached Jeff, because we were at the early stages of possibly making a movie. And I had asked him if he would be interested in, if that went forward, of like composing music for it. And that's project has not fully resolved itself. But like, when, this is a very long answer to your question, but when we
take as long as you want. I'm loving this.
But like, after we made the pictures, and then we were sort of trying to figure out, you know, we're dealing with the circumstance of knowing that, like, there's going to be very few people who are going to be able to see the show in person. You know, it's like every artist in one way or another was like challenged with the idea of like trying to think a little bit outside the box,
right,
in terms of like getting the pictures out into the world.
And how did that part of it feel, knowing that the work you wouldn't have the same kind of in-person reception as Cathedral of the Pines? Because I mean, that was there were a ton of people there. We were there opening night, as you may or may not remember, and it was packed. I mean, how does that square releasing this body of work that you've poured just as much of yourself into, to, you know, an all but empty gallery space?
Well, I mean, that's, you know, every artist, including Jeff Tweedy, I'm sure, you know, who do they have to cancel tours and,
right,
you know, have to sort of meet this challenge head on. And the way, you know, I still haven't been able to see the actual show in person, you know, and it opened in LA many weeks ago and it's about to open in Paris. I will not see either of those shows.
That's got to be strange. I mean, it's got to be just really surreal not to be able to stand in front of these, and they're enormous. I mean, these are, correct me if I'm wrong, but these are much bigger than Cathedral of the Pines, aren't they?
They're like 4 by 8 feet. And
my God.
But that's the circumstance of the world. But we're also in this like place now where we can have even a larger audience in different ways, you know. Not that it will ever replace the thing itself, because I feel very strongly that the physical picture on a wall is the thing.
Sure.
You know, it's not an image on a screen. It's not, you know, something that is digestible on Instagram or YouTube. But we knew that we'd have to like find ways to find that audience outside of the more direct experience. That's when I approached Jeff with the idea of creating a kind of soundtrack for these pictures, which he immediately agreed to do, and which was a great honor. But he just, you know, he sent us the file, and you know, it worked perfectly as I knew it would.
Did you know, he told the story behind the file in one of the talks that I saw him give. Did you know the sort of provenance behind how it was written, why it was written, and was that important in your selection of that particular tune?
I did know it, and it knocked me out because it was powerful, and was honored that he would consider allowing us to put it here, and it made perfect sense. You know, I had it came out of a similar kind of wellspring.
Sure.
So that's taken on a life of its own, and we really hope to work together in the future sometime.
It's such a stroke of just genius to add. Now, let me ask you, when you hear that music, when you're looking at the work and hearing that music, do you hear that as our soundtrack as the viewer? Or is it the soundtrack of the people inhabiting the world? Or is it your soundtrack as the creator, or something else entirely?
I think it's all of the above, you know, none of it, you know, but it's the soundtrack for that experience of viewing the pictures, you know, and that there are other ways of, you know, viewing them. Here's sort of the interesting contradiction, I think, and we talked about it a little bit in the talk we did, is that the big difference between what he does and what I do is, well, there are many differences, but one is that it's, you know, as we talked about, the photograph is still and silent, and his work exists in time. So I don't think it would have worked if it was just a soundtrack, like playing in the gallery or something.
Right.
It's really about the images in that context of almost like the slideshow of the images with that sound. That's the thing, you know, it's the coming together of my images and his music to create this third thing.
Right.
You know?
Right. And then there's this lovely sort of B-side to that where you're releasing the individual voiceovers with, yours and Julianne's notes and behind the scenes. I mean, there's just there's so much. You've given us depth in the making of as much as there's depth in the picture. And I think it's such a terrific stroke. And how has the reaction to that been? Have people really resonated with that?
Yeah, it's been great. Again, it's not meant to replace the thing itself, but it's something that we've kind of stumbled upon in the studio where, Julianne writes these descriptions well in advance of making the pictures that are like a kind of guidepost for our team and for casting.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, we were trying just to figure out additional ways to get, to continue to have the work exist outside of the gallery. And
right. But it doesn't feel tacked on. That's the thing. It doesn't feel like, oh, you know what? Our social media team said we could do this. Like it doesn't. It feels integral to the work. It feels like it's an extension of the experience of seeing the individual pictures, the pictures with the music. It feels like it's part of the same, experience. I mean, I always think of you as this sort of very similar to a musician in that you go away for a while, you come up with instead of songs, they're pictures. You write, you produce, you record, you edit and sweeten and make them as amazing as you possibly can and say exactly what you want to say, release them into the world, and then you go away again.
Yes. I really believe in going away. I don't think artists go away enough.
Why do you think that is? Is the pressure to keep yourself out there and relevant, is that the driving force behind why they don't, do you think?
I don't know. Well, on the other hand, I really admire and am jealous of artists who, can just have a continual output and shows all over the world.
It's got to be exhausting though.
Yeah. But I do feel that every artist, maybe every artist has their own kind of working process. I feel very much connected to a way of working that's like making a movie,
mm-hmm.
That under best circumstances, a filmmaker who writes and then directs and then edits their own films, that's like a 3-year process at the shortest.
Right.
It's not like they stop working at any part of that. And that's more of my natural kind of working cycle. It's also there are pragmatic reasons, you have to organize the budget and find ways to get the money. All that stuff is part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, so there's the pre-production, there's production, there's post-production, and that takes years.
When we see a body of work from you, because of all of those things, because of there's so much time and energy that you have to put into previs and props and casting and location and all of that, I would imagine that you don't have any, or maybe not any, but I don't imagine that you have much room for error in terms of by the time it gets in front of your lens, it's necessarily a keeper because so much pre-production has gone into it. Am I reading that wrong, or is that pretty close?
Well, there's always photography at the end is about editing and, there'll be good pictures. And I mean, we've been fairly lucky.
Mm-hmm.
We were very lucky in this last group where we used all 16 of the pictures.
Wow.
In the end.
Wow.
But there have been times when the percentages weren't nearly as good. But in the end, either a picture works or it doesn't work.
Right.
And no amount of post-production can make something what it isn't.
Right. Right. I had a terrific question from a listener who called in on one of the live shows and was asking if great art has to come out of great struggle. Does great art come from great strife? And if we ignore great for a minute, because that's so subjective, does struggle inherently produce more compelling art?
I think art by its very nature is hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it shouldn't feel easy. I don't think. It should represent a struggle on some level. Now, what that struggle is, could be open ended, but like it's partially because you're impressing something out of the world. Like you're sort of, it's an act of creation, and any act of creation, in terms of whatever it is not easy. And for me, I think like most artists, there's always a relationship between your life and your work, and all lives go through like ups and downs and difficulty and complication. And in one way or another, I think art needs to sort of represent that.
Mm-hmm. Are you able to see that when you look at your own work? Are you able to look back on your work and see sort of where you were in the process in your own journey just based on the work?
Oh, absolutely. Again, it's not conscious, or never has been directly conscious. But for instance, when I was making these pictures, I wasn't really aware of it at the time, but I was going through a series of health issues, having like very mysterious symptoms, not sleeping, exhausted, various other ailments.
Wow. Are you okay?
Yeah, well, it was a real struggle making the pictures. And almost directly after, I wound up going to a sleep lab, and it turns out I had severe sleep disorders.
Oh, wow.
And which has been corrected.
But you weren't aware of them sort of in real time?
No, I mean, I was aware that I was like falling asleep, driving and
oh my God.
Yeah, it was not good.
Wow.
But now I look back at those pictures and I see it, I see the theme of like brokenness, and like there's, the figures have various ailments, and maybe in some way, they're kind of a reflection of what I was going through.
Wow.
And again, there's not a direct line that, between this kind of the artist and the thing, the artwork, but
right.
There is always, or should be, a connection. Yeah.
Was there a conscious point for you when you saw your own work become more personal? Or you saw more of you reflected in your work? Maybe that might be a better way to say it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like my pictures are, like if you look at my pictures, you probably could, in almost an ideal circumstance, you will know everything and nothing about me.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think my pictures are personal in the most direct way.
Right.
In fact, there's a lot about my pictures that are like intentionally detached, or removed. I always say that like in my pictures, I want the sense of something, a certain kind of detachment coming together with a certain kind of intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So you have both things. You have figures and moments of private reflection, yet photographed in a way that's like somewhat removed.
Right, right. As you go deeper into this world, are you any better at seeing around the corner of what comes next, or do you still surprise yourself?
Yeah, I never know what comes next. If I knew what would come next, I wouldn't have to do it.
Oh, come on, you'd still have to do it.
Yeah. I'm just starting now to think about the next body of work, and so I'm readying myself to disappear again.
If you'd like to see an Eclipse of Moths or any of Gregory's work, head over to gagosian.com/artists/Gregory-Crudson, and I'll include that link in the show notes. I'll also include a link to the video showing all of the work from an Eclipse of Moths, accompanied by music by Jeff Tweedy. You can connect with Gregory on Instagram and Twitter at Crudson Studio. That's CREWDSONSTUDIO. Subscribe to Process Driven in your favorite podcast app. Or if you'd like to get every episode of Process Driven, along with my other shows in between and iterations, subscribe to Jeffrey Sidoris Everything. I'm going to be making some changes to the show lineup over the coming weeks, so be sure to subscribe to Everything so you don't miss anything. Connect with me on Instagram and Twitter at Jeffrey Sidoris, that's JEFFERYSADDORIS, or on my website at jeffreysidoris.com. If you've got questions or feedback, email me at talkback@jeffreysidoris.com. You can support the shows by telling a friend or by sharing them on social media. I'll be back in a week or so with another show, and I hope you'll join me. Until then, as always, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being here. I'll talk to you on the next one.